Welcome everyone. I'm going to give a couple seconds for people to trickle in from the waiting room. Welcome to the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities Self-Advocate Discussion Series. I am Chris Hendrix. I'm the Policy Education Coordinator for the Council. I'd like to take a moment to extend a special welcome to the newest staff at the NCCDD, Irlanda Ruiz. Irlanda is the first staff in a newly created position, Hispanic Community Disability Advocate. So let's give a nice self-advocate welcome to Irlanda. On behalf of the Council, thank you all for being here. This discussion is a place for North Carolina's self-advocates to gather and engage each other to talk about things that affect our lives as people experiencing life with IDD and other disabilities. And we want this time together used to get to know each other and to get to know the Council, where I and other individuals with IDD are leaders, colleagues, who are valued for our input because we are who we are. People with disabilities should always be valued like that, and this discussion series demonstrates why and how. This month, we'll be having a discussion around identity in the IDD community. So what does that mean? Well, in short, that means that different people like to be acknowledged or identified by different words. Today, we're going to talk about identity preferences. We're going to talk about communication style and how we like to engage in conversations. And most of all, we're going to talk about how we acknowledge each other as self-advocates in the IDD community, showing respect for ourselves and one another. As a brief introduction, we'll begin with the Americans with Disabilities Act and explore its history in acknowledgement of disability. Then we'll talk about our personal preferences and how communication has evolved over time. Throughout today's discussion, I encourage you to ask yourself, how do I like to be identified or acknowledged? And you'll be encouraged with some examples from your fellow advocates today. And in the end, we hope today's session will inspire confidence and make communication and understanding between self-advocates and community leaders a little bit easier. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to get things started as we often do with a little humor. Here's our joke of the day. All right, everyone, why did the computer go to the doctor? Because it had a virus. Get it? I love it. All right. Why was the mathematics book crying? Because it has many problems. I love the cheesiness of these jokes. There's no better way to relax into this group together. All right. Now that we're relaxed, let's get into some of this material. When the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities wants to make an impact, we always begin with the DD Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And right now, I'll speak about the ADA. Believe it or not, 33 years ago and 7 days from now, this very month, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. July 26, 1990. It's a civil rights law that prevents discrimination based on disability. The protection crosses several areas, including employment, transportation, public accommodations, government programs, and of course, communication. And as of the year 2000, protections around communications include person-first language, and this can be found in the Development Disabilities Act. And we thought that the ADA would be a great place to start a discussion about self-identity. So what is person-first language? Well, when you think about it, it's pretty simple. the person is emphasized before the disability. In other words, the person comes first. As an example, person who is blind would be an example of person first language, whereas the blind is an example of language that emphasizes the disability. As a matter of fact, in the United States, People First was a civil rights movement that began in the 1970s with persons who had disabilities. They wanted to be recognized as individuals who happened to have disabilities and not the other way around. Look at us being trendsetters. So let's compare some examples on the next slide and see how different identities make us feel about ourselves and those in our community. Okay, can everyone see the graph on the slide? An example of person first language will be person with an intellectual, cognitive, and developmental disability. Some negatively implied language would be the R word. We don't say the R word out loud ever, but I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with it. Person who is blind or person who is visually impaired versus the blind. That would be the example I just gave. Person with a disability versus the disabled or handicapped. Person who is deaf versus the deaf. Person who is hard of hearing versus suffers a hearing loss. Person who has multiple sclerosis versus afflicted by MS. And person with cerebral palsy, I happen to have CP, versus CP victim. So as I've read each of these, I hope you're taking the time to think about how they make you feel. And now I'd like you to share any thoughts that you have since we've gone through these examples. And you can share in a variety of different ways. You can share your thoughts in the chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and unmute. And remember, we are here for you, the participants, to engage in discussion. So I'd just like to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't, please feel free to turn on your camera if you're willing, because it helps us feel a sense of connection. But I realize that takes a little bit of bravery. So if you're not ready to do that right now and you want to feel a little bit more connected before you do that, I understand. But I encourage you to do so because we want to connect with you in as many ways as we possibly can. Would anyone like to share how any of those particular phrases make you feel? I'll start. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see Jenna in the chat. Jenna says in the chat, the R word is still too commonplace. You're absolutely right. You know what's funny about that to me is that even saying, this is Chris Hendrix, by the way, even saying the R word, just not even saying the word, just saying the R word gives me the worst kind of butterflies in my stomach.
This is Melissa. In the chat, Yvonne Bell wrote the word handicapped. Yvonne, do you want to come off mute and maybe?
You said what words people say too much? They used to say handicap more in the past, but I haven't heard it much lately. It usually say disabled now.
In countries, Argentina, Brazil, other places,
Thank you, Yvonne.
You're welcome.
Is that right?
This is Chris. Phyllis Marshall Rice in the chat says, it's a constant job to even get some professionals to say a person with Down syndrome versus he's Downs.
Ouch. Ooh.
David Johnson III in the chat. As people with Down syndrome being referred to as mongoloid. My goodness. I want to take a moment to remind everyone here that while this is a controversial topic, we are here for you and you are here to share how you feel. So we're here to embrace your feelings about these things. So don't be afraid to be honest and open about this topic. And I appreciate your honesty, David. I don't like it either, David.
This is Melissa. I just want to say thank you to all of you brave folks for putting information in the chat and for participating in this discussion. And so you're definitely proving the need for this particular self-advocate discussion series so we can talk about this is how we want to be empowered and identified. So well done to all of you here.
This is Chris Hendrix. I second Melissa's share. I myself was struck by victim of CP or CP victim. I still hear that far too often. And it just leads into this idea that persons with conditions, as I like to call it, we'll get more into that a little bit later, but that persons with conditions are persons who should be felt sorry for. And we all know that is not true. Yvonne in the chat says survivor, not victim. Absolutely. Harry Mart says, and I have many, many friends in my life. Absolutely. That's another misconception, is that we are a group of people with very few friends and few relationships. Couldn't be further from the truth. I'll give one more moment for anyone else who'd like to share. Yvonne says, some people think we don't have family either. A lot of brave shares today, y'all. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for sharing. There's going to be more time for participation shortly, but we wanted to illustrate a simple idea. Words are charged. They're charged with feeling. Some words lift us up, while others bring us down. And this is exactly why we're taking the time today to become more self-aware around language. We are only 15 minutes into today's presentation, and already I've been, even just as a facilitator, I've learned things from you all and become more self-aware. And we're here today so that we can better serve each other and ourselves. This is about being self-empowered too. So let's talk about personal preference for a moment. So while person-first language is a great place to start, language in our community and culture is not always that simple. The truth is that the ultimate answer, it's all about personal preference. In other words, how you feel as an individual is all that matters. For example, person with a disability is technically person-first language, and I, as an individual with cerebral palsy, am a person with a disability. However, that statement is not how I like to identify myself. I prefer the statement person with a condition. Personally, I feel like the word disability implies that I'm missing something that the world expects of me. And for me, the word condition is acknowledging my disability without implying a perspective of lack. But that's just me. Some persons with disabilities prefer identity-first language. In other words, they feel empowered by terms like disabled person. They feel that by having the word disability second, it implies that the identity itself is a weakness. I can absolutely hear where they're coming from. So did anyone here see the documentary, the movie Crip Camp? It was released in 2020. It's one of my favorite documentaries, and there's a few people here that have seen it. And you can see that at the time, some persons with disabilities used slang terms to empower themselves and their culture around an idea. The title itself, Crip Camp, is an example of that. The title of the award-winning documentary now showing on Netflix about a camp for persons with disabilities that started a revolution that led to the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We all know that when it comes to grassroots movements, in order to empower the people that we're trying to inspire, you got to get down and dirty sometimes. And that documentary is certainly an example of that. So what does all of this mean? It means that language is circular. It's ever evolving, and most importantly, it's deeply personal. You've heard me say the word personal 10 or more times already. As persons with disabilities, we use words to define, teach, inspire, and mold our experience in the world for us to enjoy and others to understand. Let me say that again. For us to enjoy and others to understand. As Shannon Woolridge, a public affairs specialist for the National Institute of Health Office of Communications, man, that's a mouthful. She writes, the goal of person-first language to avoid language that dehumanizes or stigmatizes people, it's a worthy goal. However, we must be curious, creative, respectful, and flexible depending on the person or the situation. Every person and situation is different, but one thing is certain. People often have a deep sense of pride around the words they use to identify themselves. Only by sharing in the pride and respect can we grow into the kind of community that creates the change we wish to see in this world. As we think about the power of language, I'd like to introduce you to our self-advocate speaker for today's session. He is the executive assistant for the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities and staffs the NACDD Self-Advocacy Committee. Please give a warm self-advocate welcome to Eric Berg. Hey, Eric, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. So you are a very smart and very active guy, especially when it comes to advocacy and the NACDD. So in your own words, what exactly is the NACDD and what's your role there? And what is the NACDD's Self-Advocate Committee? I know that's a lot, but.
So I'll try to break that down a little bit there. the NACDD is the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, which is itself a big mouthful of an acronym. Essentially what it is right now we're in the North Carolina DD self-advocate discussion series. The NACDD is the national level. Its job is essentially to help all of the different DD councils. Every state and territory of the United States has its own DD council as mandated by the DD Act, essentially to help them talk together, work together, bring in funding for them, help councils not reinvent the wheel. If, say, one state wants to try doing a new project, and we know that the same project has been tried over in this state, initiating the conversation between these two states so that they can learn from each other and essentially not have to go through the same process from scratch each and every single time. And my job there is I'm an executive assistant. I help out our CEO, Donna Meltzer, just general organizational admin tasks. And I am also the lead staff person for many of the NACDD self-advocacy initiatives. The Self-Advocate Discussion Series, the Self-Advocacy Committee, and that's the next bit I'd like to talk about. Common misconception, the committee is not the Self-Advocate Committee. It's not solely for self-advocates, but it's for anyone with an interest in furthering the cause of self-advocacy as far as it relates to the National Association of DD Councils, NACDD, on the national level, ensuring that self-advocates sort of have their voice being heard, what are the best practices regarding self-advocacy, and all of that. Does that answer the question, Chris?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, I knew it was a lot, but you tackled it very, very well. So I really appreciate that. And both myself and my colleague, who's also here with us, Melissa, had the pleasure of being a part of some of these meetings. It was actually Melissa who encouraged me to join. And the first or second meeting that I was a part of, I want to say the first one, actually over the course of most of the meeting, the committee needed to create a disability identity position statement. And that's a really important thing. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what that is and why the committee needed to create it?
Yeah, so a position statement is essentially stating the stance of an organization. What is our take on this issue? What is our stance? What are we saying about it? Just stating for the world, what is our position? And the Self-Advocacy Committee needed to create a position statement on, well, let me backtrack a little bit there. So the Self-Advocacy Committee created a position statement on whether to use person first or identity first language in the communications, and more on how that ended up in a moment. But to begin with, it was actually when the strategic plan for NACD, the strategic plan being the sort of big long-term, what are we actually trying to do and how are we going to accomplish this plan, was being worked on. The working group decided to try and throw in a little bit about person first, our identity first language, and even this very small working group of, I think it was somewhere along the lines of 6 or 7 people from many different councils, found that positions were split almost across the board on the importance of person first or identity first language. And so I believe it was one of our self-advocate members on that small working group who said, hey, let's put this to the Self-Advocacy Committee because this really is sort of their position. I'm sorry, sort of their territory to try and stake out a position on this. And so at the next self-advocacy meeting, I think this is the one before you were there, Chris. There was a very brief initial survey of, should the position statement be person first or identity first language? And there was no consensus whatsoever. Feelings were extraordinarily strong in both directions. Some people are strident for person first language. Some people are very strident for identity first language. And other people's opinions weren't, as strong in either direction. Some people even prefer to use both for different purposes. But very quickly, it became obvious that there was no consensus whatsoever. And so at the next meeting that you were a part of, Chris, really the task came down to start crafting this position statement when people have very different feelings on the matter. What can the position possibly be? And the end result, after a lot of work, was essentially that both person first and identity first language and communications are acceptable, and it's to the individual's choice which one they want to go with.
Yeah, this is Chris. You're absolutely right, Eric. And to clarify some things and get into some details for our audience, taking 90 minutes to really drill down on something that is 2 or 3 sentences should give everyone here on this call an idea around just how important and how powerful words are to people and to different groups of people. So, and you kind of answered another question already that I had here, Eric. So I'll just go right into the deep nitty-gritty of it all. What do you think about self-identifying or not around disability and your own personal position statement about disability identity, why it's important to you?
Well, to drag you back for a little bit there, the question of person first versus identity first language is about 2 or 3 sentences. However, the position statement that the Self-Advocacy Committee ended up crafting is 5 paragraphs long. So really goes in depth on answering that question to the fullest and utmost. And it took the whole committee, as you said, about 90 minutes of just solid wordsmithing to come to a position that everyone could agree on. And now, as far as what I think, I do think that from an organizational level, having a position statement on how does the organization stand can be very important. Especially if it's an organization trying to bring about change in some way, shape, or form, or if all of the members of said organization really feel a very specific way. From a personal level, I don't really think that you need to throw out a statement for yourself individually. Melissa, yes, we absolutely can share the full 5-page position statement documents. It is something that is going to the board to be ratified. It's not presently the held position, but I can certainly share the proposed document for ratification. I'm sorry, I got a little bit off track there regarding
That's okay. That's all right. And I appreciate you going a little more behind the scenes there and sharing how big the document actually is, because I realize you all did not craft all of that in a single meeting. That would have been impossible, an impossible task for anyone.
There was, in fact, a language subcommittee of the Self-Advocacy Committee that created the initial draft, and then from there it got fine-tuned and wordsmithed.
See, once again, y'all, this is how important language is. It's a committee that required a committee. It just doesn't get any deeper than that. Words, just as a gentle reminder, I know I said it already, can bring us down, can lift us up. But most importantly, if heard loud enough and clear enough, can create change. That's why we focus so hard on that. Eric, I want to really thank you for your time and your wisdom today. Your perspective is so informative and so empowering. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this, Chris.
Absolutely. Well, and the next part, I hope you're going to take part in as well, because this is going to be our group discussion. Because now we want to hear from our attendees, our audience. Please share your thoughts on self-identifying as a person with IDD. If you'll direct your attention to the PowerPoint that Melissa's being kind enough to share, you'll see some examples of discussion questions that we might consider. And I'm going to start with 2 questions, and if there's more time, I'll go into a couple more. But first and foremost, anyone in the audience, you can answer in the chat. You can raise your hand and share your voice over Zoom, however you feel comfortable answering. How do you identify yourself as a member of the IDD community? And just as an example, I personally, just as a reminder, I identify myself as a person with a condition because that's empowering to me. But what's empowering to you? We want to hear from you. This is all about you right now. Yvonne says either way is okay. Any other thoughts? We got plenty of time, and I know that this is a sensitive topic, so it might feel a little challenging to come out of our shell and share today, and you've already shared some pretty deep and what some people might consider scary things, so I understand hesitation. All right, well, while y'all are thinking about that, we'll go on to the second question, because I know that first one can be kind of tough. What does comfortable communication mean to you? Anyone on this call, talk about what comfortable communication means. How do you feel? What kind of communication makes you feel at ease, calm, opens you up, allows you to be yourself? I want to take a moment to share some things in the chat. Rachel shared, I'm with a participant that says, I identify as unique. I love that perspective. That's awesome. Jenna Gallo, with regards to comfortable communication, trusting the other person. You're right, Jenna, that's really, really important. Trusting the other person is huge. But let me ask you or anyone else who wants to jump in on this. Trusting the other person, that's really, really important. But what about when you interact with someone you haven't met before? What if trust hasn't been established yet? What can we do to create comfortable communication?
This is Melissa. Eric Berg, if you have any answers to these questions or you want to comment about them as our guest speaker and presenter for the day, please don't hesitate to throw out some answers that come to your head or not, whatever you're most comfortable with. That's the point.
No, I did want to throw myself in there and, interrupting a conversation going on. I did throw something in the chat that I forgot to mention. Some people even combine the languages that they use to refer to different areas of themselves in different ways.
That they do. Do you want to expand on what you shared in the chat? And actually, before you do, forgive me, let me just share some other things. Sarah Potter says mutual respect and courtesy. You're absolutely right. And Teresa Bradley Bullock says icebreakers and introducing yourself to them. And Teresa, I'm going to ask, when you say introducing yourself to them, do you mean us as self-advocates introducing ourselves to other people, or the other individuals introducing themselves to us, or both? And Yvonne says, after intros, nothing else is said. Yvonne, what do you mean by that?
Just conversation goes dead. It usually doesn't go further, usually. Like they might just say, oh, okay, and that's it. Then it's over. You understand what I mean?
Like the trust hasn't been established, and so the conversation doesn't go anywhere from that.
I guess not. They usually don't carry a conversation further than a little, I guess, small talk, whatever, which is very boring to me. I like small talk. I like to talk about deep stuff, politics or history or, and it usually doesn't go that far,
Yvonne, that's a really good point. I think that oftentimes when we're first meeting someone, conversation starts on the surface, but as long as conversation continues, you wind up getting deeper and deeper. And I wonder why the conversation can often sort of disappear after a short
I don't know.
time.
That's what I don't understand.
Does anybody else on the call want to take a stab or curious attempt at answering that question? Why conversation falls away after the surfacey stuff? I wonder if it's, go ahead.
This is Melissa. I wanted to acknowledge that Teresa had come on camera because she wanted to finish what she had started earlier. Thank you, Teresa.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. Forgive me for missing that. Teresa, please jump in.
That is okay. I was just saying that, icebreakers and just introducing yourself sometimes starts up a conversation with people when they're uncomfortable to talk. That kind of helps out. That's all.
Teresa, that's really well said. Do you think that, I've often asked this question, do you think that as self-advocates, it's up to us to put ourselves out there and help continue the conversation? Or do you think we should really rely on others? Or do you think it depends on the situation?
I think it's up to us to kind of put ourselves out there in some situations, and then, other situations, I guess it just, sometimes things just kind of fall in place. Depends on what you're advocating about. So I feel that it's good to put yourself out there at times, and then sometimes it's just kind of sit back and kind of listen.
So I think that's really well said too, Teresa. What I think I hear you saying is that it really is situational.
Yes, very much situational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? I recognize in my own personal situation, I know I'm saying I a lot today, which I need to stop doing. I can only speak from my own personal experience, but to something Yvonne said in the chat, and also it relates back to what you shared. Teresa. Yvonne says that's why nothing nicer gets said, not open enough or never open enough. I think that depending on the situation and depending on the condition or disability, whichever is empowering for you, people who are not used to our world have a hard time breaking the ice these days because they don't want to step on our toes. But the truth is, I think we are way braver than people give us credit for. And if they realized that, they would be bold enough to be open and honest about how they felt, and we could get into some of that deeper conversation. And that's just my take on things. But I am just one person, y'all.
Well, I think Eric in the chat has also added to the conversation that you and Teresa are having, where he says there is the idea that deeper conversations aren't appropriate for new conversations or people that you don't already know.
In response to Yvonne there, yeah, the societal programming of, how do we interact with people that we don't already know that everyone carries? There is that idea that some of those deeper conversations that Yvonne mentioned would be much nicer to have are just not appropriate for newer acquaintances, people you don't already know. And so people don't go there. And I think there's a question of how do you have that bridge to have that communication to get past the initial small talk. How's the weather?
The ever exciting
That's
opener.
not so good. How's the weather? Is like one of the emptiest statements I ever hear is how's the weather, or it's so hot out here. Like we don't already know that. You know what I mean?
Yvonne, I totally agree with you. I think that surface conversation is incredibly boring.
Yeah. And it's not, to me, inappropriate means sexual stuff. I mean, there's nothing wrong with talking about politics or stuff. If you really respect each other, there shouldn't even be any arguing, and deep talk shouldn't be an issue. But to me, when someone says inappropriate, it means sexual talk. That's inappropriate when you first meet somebody.
That's a good point too, Yvonne. People have different opinions on what appropriate and inappropriate is.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we all sort of fall into that trap of assuming what's appropriate and not appropriate. Jenna Gallows says it really does take time and investment for the relationship to develop. Sarah Potter says sometimes it takes time to feel comfortable with others. Some people are shy and need time to develop trust and share and be open. I think all of that's true. I can just share from my own personal experience. I've heard lots of different things around identity and disability. I've heard some people say, let me talk about my condition right up front, right off the bat, because it's something to get out of the way almost. That's sort of their vibe. Or, it can be all the way on the other end, which is, I don't feel comfortable telling anyone about my condition, and I want to do the best I can to hide it or let it come out on its own. And depending on the situation, I don't think either of those things are necessarily appropriate. But I also think that a lot of times for persons with conditions, we almost have no choice but to wear the deepest part of ourselves on the surface, if that makes sense. And that's why I think that people can be hesitant to have continued conversations with us, which is why, in my opinion, and again, just my opinion, it can be left up to the person with the condition to break the ice, as opposed to waiting for others to make assumptions.
And when you say on the surface, what do you mean? You mean they don't want to expose themselves as being disabled as well?
Well, I mean that Well, first of all, I think that some persons with disabilities are not necessarily comfortable with the world knowing
Oh,
everything
I do
about
that all the time. Hide it. Yeah. Sometimes I try to hide it. Depends on who I'm around. When you're like, when I'm around neurotypicals, I try to pass. So yeah, and then there's times I'm okay with exposing it if I'm around other people with the same or similar issues. Then I'm okay with talking about it. You know.
Absolutely.
So I understand that. Understand that angle too. Yeah.
Hey, Chris, I think one of the biggest things is wanting to be accepted for who you are, not for your disability. You just want to be accepted and be, as normal as possible. You want to have a normal life, be a normal person, and you don't want to be judged by a disability. So that's why a lot of times the deeper conversations don't come out at first, because you want to kind of, I guess, say, pace yourself. You might have barriers up or walls up, for maybe could have been judged in the past because of a disability. So you kind of scale back just a little bit.
Teresa, you're right. Some people got barriers. Some people let it come out and trickle out in pieces. As Sarah Potter says, some people don't have any filters at all. They just let it all out. That was me in college. I let it all out. I wore t-shirts. I was doing backflips and waving flags and letting everybody know right up front what I had going on. And it wasn't until later on in life that I realized that this is indeed a situational thing.
Also,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Nope, go ahead. Go ahead.
I said also safety issues. You don't want to always tell your disabilities or other things going on that, because you don't want to be stalked or followed or preyed on. So if you're around the wrong crowd, you can't expose that much when you're with a similar crowd as you feel comfortable with people with similar conditions. So safety is an issue too.
Absolutely, safety. I hadn't even thought of that, and you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
This is Melissa.
That's why I don't tell everybody I'm legally blind. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please, no, I'm interrupting you. And I wanted to thank you, Yvonne, for reminding us, particularly the folks that are responsible for kind of hosting the Self-Advocate discussion series, that we're also talking about settings that aren't just in the advocacy setting. So
right.
We come from the perspective with this advocacy discussion series that we are trying to raise the bar with all of us to advocate for better lives and conditions and opportunities for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's one of the reasons why we had somebody from our national association come and talk with us, because in our professional setting, this is all about helping us all become better advocates and self-advocates related to policy and systems change. But then we also attract folks who have a life outside of advocacy, and that the things that you have put on the table as far as identifying as a person with a disability and particularly developmental disabilities, is that you've just got to pick and choose what audience that you're around and where you are. And so I think that was something that Chris and I didn't really discuss much about as we were preparing for, different questions and things that we needed to take into consideration, both the setting of an advocate, because we really encourage folks with disabilities to literally do, people first with the disability, even though all of us would just rather be called Melissa and Chris and Yvonne and Eric, right? We would all just rather 24 hours a day, we would really just like to be identified as ourselves. So thank you again, Yvonne.
Oh, you're welcome. We just want to be people like anyone else. But yeah, when safety is an issue, you have to be really careful when you're around regular people, so-called regular people. You know what I mean? People without disabilities, because you don't know what's who's out there looking and following you or stalking you, or what somebody try to prey on you. You know, because they think you'll be a pushover. So.
Yvonne, you're absolutely right.
Mhm.
There's that, this actually translates well to what Jenna shared in the chat, which is typically people often incorrectly assume a disability equates to an intelligence deficit, which can be a
Right.
barrier to communication. The biggest thing, the biggest barrier to all of us coming together is assumptions. And I think there are more assumptions in our community, in our culture, than many of the others out there. And again, I can only speak from personal experience, and that's just been my that has just been my personal experience. So many assumptions. Just as an example, my partner in life, that I'm in a relationship with, people assume that she's my caregiver, or my sister, or my cousin. We couldn't possibly be in a relationship because I have a disability, right? But we've been together for almost 8 years, and I have a 5-year-old daughter, right? That's an assumption. Have any of you all come across any of your own assumptions around your disability identity, or any other examples of assumptions? And David Johnson says there's also a fear factor. Absolutely. Fear of how to move forward. Yvonne, I would just, does anyone want to answer? I have an answer to that question, but I want to offer, does anyone else on the call have an answer to Yvonne? I completely agree with where you're coming from. Fear of what? Yvonne says in the chat. Does anyone else want to answer Yvonne's question?
David went on to say, people fear what they don't understand.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, a tale as old as time.
Yeah, that makes sense. But also, well, actually, it does make sense to me, because if you don't understand something, I ask more questions, not less.
That's also a really good point, Yvonne.
Right, because if I'm scared of it, I might stand back from something I'm physically scared of. But if it's something mentally scared, I ask more questions or wonder and want to know more about it. If I'm mentally scared of something, and I want to ask a bunch of questions. So yeah, I'm glad you understand that. Mm-hmm.
To that point, I'm just going to, as the facilitator, make a note of the time. We've got about 1 more minute left for this discussion. Would anyone like to say, share one more thing around disability identity before we move on? All right. Well, on to the next slide. Oop, I lost a little bit of my screen here. Now we're going to share some resources. First of all, you'll find a link to Identity First Language, an article around Identity First Language and what it means. And the next resource is a link to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the next is an article on Persons First and Identity First Language. And I believe that link goes to the graph that I shared earlier. And then below that, you have ADA guidance for writing and communication for persons with disabilities. And then a link to the CRIP Camp documentary. And I saw in the chat earlier, by the way, that when I saw the documentary, it was on Netflix, but I know that Netflix does tend to pull off certain things, movies for whatever reason, and I'll look up other places to view it and share that with y'all in the next resources email. And I believe Kaiba, forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Kaiba says, please go back to the resources slide for a moment. Just so you know, I'm going to be sharing all these resources with you in an email. And I know that some of you are waiting on the resources slide from our previous self-advocate discussion series on transportation. I am working on it, y'all. I am waiting on another individual to send some resources before I send that out to everyone. But as soon as that comes through, I'll be sharing that with all of you. So don't worry, everyone that you hear, I'm going to send you an email with all of these resources. And next slide, please. Events and opportunities. Check out the upcoming Lunch and Learn with Meet the Need, how to develop relationships with your legislator. And check out the Self-Advocate Resources and Technical Assistance Center for more information on resources like person first language resources and communication, but it also has other resources on the website as well. And I wanted to give 2 minutes to Mr. Eric Berg to talk a little bit more about the about his role in his organization before we close out. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, if you haven't had enough self-advocate discussion series in your life, NACDD is having our own self-advocate discussion series tomorrow, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern. I believe North Carolina is on that same time zone. I'm going to make sure that Chris has this for distribution. I'm just going to throw this in the chat here as well. If you would like to join us tomorrow, it's going to be on housing. It's an hour long. A little bit less of a discussion period, but talking about your resources slide there, we do have a guest presenter from ASA and Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, who will be talking about housing policy, housing resources, everything to do with living situations.
Eric, you have no idea how perfect that is, because we are also, so first of all, definitely direct yourselves to the chat. We did indeed put, Eric did share in the chat the link to that self-advocate discussion. And our next self-advocate discussion series, which is August 16th, I believe, Melissa can correct me if I'm wrong, if I am, is also going to be on housing. And we're going to have a housing panel, so you can get super housed and just learn a ton between the two of us on housing resources and opportunities around housing and living situations. And please, I'm gonna take this note as Eric has just shared. Please feel free to invite other people you might that you think would be interested. But he says, do not share that link on social media. Do not share that link on social media. Well, with that, y'all, the time flew by way faster than I anticipated. I want to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreters. I want to take a moment to thank our Spanish interpreters. I want to thank Irlanda for being with us today. I want to thank our fantastic speaker, Eric Berg, and everyone who has put this together, worked really hard to put this thing together behind the scenes. And I want to clarify something before we officially close out. Time for that self-advocate discussion series for ours, August 16th, is 1 to 2 p.m. on that Wednesday. And for Eric's self-advocate discussion series, it is 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. So we hope to see you at
that's
both.
your time zone?
I'm sorry?
I want to say that's your time zone?
It is.
Okay.
You're quite right.
Yeah, so
4
to 5 local for you.
And also want to take a moment to thank the captioner for making that resource available to those who need it. Thank you all so much for a wonderful discussion. I know that this was a deep one, and it was a challenging topic, and it took a lot of bravery. Thank you so much for being brave today. We hope you'll join us for our next Self-Advocate discussion series. We appreciate you all. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
What a wonderful way to spend an hour. Eric, can't thank you enough for being a part of our own Self-Advocate discussion series session. We usually hang out for 10 or 15 minutes as a staff team after the session, so we can kind of debrief a little bit. If you don't mind staying here for just a couple more minutes, I'd love to know a little bit comparison of what you experienced as you saw us getting ready earlier to put the session on, and the pre-conversations. How similar is or dissimilar is our setup and practices to the one that you experience and lead for the NACDD?
Can do. You are still recording, by the way. Not sure if you want to be doing that.
Yeah, we can stop recording now. Letha, I'm sure Letha is on that.
But as far as what we've got going on, you've got a lot more going on